Welcome to This Is Not a Watermelon. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on the series, we have Dr. Victor Kattan, who is an assistant professor in public international law at the University of Nottingham School of Law. We were recording this interview on Tuesday, May 22nd at 5 p.m., just in case anything happens since the recording. Welcome, Victor, to the series.
Thanks, Mikey. It's great to be here. Although according to my calendar, it says it's the 21st of May.
The 21st of May. Did I not say 21st?
22nd. You said it's the 22nd. It's all right.
You know, in Beirut, it feels like we're living in the future often. So where capitalism has failed. So, this is a conversation that I wanted to have because I'm always curious to talk about international law when it comes to the history, the most recent, last 100 years in Palestine, because it feels like a place where international law doesn't apply and has never and almost have never applied. So maybe before we jump into this conversation, if you can give us a sense of what drew you into this, into studying this, and then I'd love to talk about that idea of where international law starts and stops when you think about the conflict.
Okay. Well, thanks, Mikey. So I got interested in this topic from my family. I guess my family roots. My father's family are from Palestine, from Bethlehem, and going there growing up in an environment where Palestine wasn't really discussed until one summer. After I did my GCSEs, my father got a job. Actually, he got a job in Gaza, of all places. It was the World Health Organization, and he said, "Well, I want you to come and meet your family. It'd be a good opportunity for you to meet the cousins." And that was in 1996. So a very different Gaza to the one we know today. And so I got to travel out there, saw the checkpoints, saw how people would treat, Palestinians, how my family was treated. Back in those days, I recall it wasn't as privatized, the security system at the airport, so it was still the soldiers, military uniforms, searching bags and luggage and the car and the like. Although I do recall taking a taxi from Bethlehem, a green taxi, one of those old yellow Mercedes-Benz taxis from Bethlehem all the way to Jaffa. And so you could still even do that trip then in the summer of '96. So obviously that experience and what I saw shaped my interest. I remember going back to school and reading up everything, reading up as much as I could on the conflict. In fact, I think I was reading prior to that trip. I was just intrigued, and I guess my interest was really began at that moment. And then I went to university, and after university, during my last year as an undergrad, the Second Palestinian Intifada began. It was in the news, and I was following that. And we ended up going to. We were actually I went back to Palestine for the Bethlehem 2000, so just for Christmas 2000, just before things kicked off. So again, that I was intrigued by that, and then I after my studies, I did my masters so my undergrad in London, my masters in Leiden in the Netherlands. I volunteered for a refugee NGO called Badil, and they were also based in Bethlehem. And I suppose when I was doing my studies, I wasn't actually studying international law at the time. It's something that I went into because of my interest in the conflict, and it was apparently the only law that applied to it. And we'll discuss the problem. So I guess that was my interest, working for an NGO, coming back, working a bit as a journalist, but with this legal knowledge, and then thinking, what could I do was this knowledge in law and my experiences, and then doing a PhD at SOAS, School of Oriental African Studies in London, going back a few more times, and then getting a job after my PhD with the what was called the Negotiation Support Unit, which is a technical office formerly under the umbrella of the PLO in Ramallah. Used to be run by Adam Smith International, but when I used to be managed by Adam Smith International, but when I joined, it was being ostensibly managed by the United Nations Development Programme. And so that gave me an insight. And I'd been publishing a lot in between for blogs, for
Yeah.
newspapers. I published a book as well in between that. So that's I guess where I was coming from.
So let's talk about the book. A book came out in 2009, From Coexistence to Conquest: International Law and the Origins of the Arab-Israeli Conflict, 1891 to 1949. International law. In this case, when you look at the domain of international law, maybe the simple question is, does international law apply to the conflict, to the occupation in Palestine?
Well, if I was answering that question today, I'd say, of course it does. But this conflict, as you alluded to, and as the book alludes to, has been going on for a long time. And so we go back to the roots of the conflict. It goes back to the height of the imperial age, late 19th, early 20th centuries, when international law was an unequal and frankly discriminatory system based on hierarchy. And it was enshrined in the law. So Palestine was a League of Nations mandate territory, which meant it wasn't a sovereign member of the League of Nations, but it had this kind of special status, and they were categorized into A class, B class, C class mandates. Palestine, being part of the former Ottoman Empire, was classed as an A mandate, but it still meant that the Brits, who eventually took control over the mandate, it meant that the discretion as to when Palestine would become independent was left in the hands of the British Empire, who basically ran the place. But as you know, Palestine, of all the mandates, was the most complex and unusual, because while ostensibly they were trying to create a nation to become independent, they also had a colonizing scheme, which was enshrined in the Balfour Declaration, as that was enshrined in the mandate, which was to encourage Jewish migration from Europe to Palestine to establish a Jewish national home. And this obviously led to conflict between the indigenous population and those who were coming at that time from Europe. And you had the birth of the modern Arab-Israeli conflict. But this was all taking place in a time, well, international law supposedly going through a flux at that time. So from classic colonial period of 19th century law, during which there was annexation, was lawful and the like, after the First World War, the kind of the idea of no annexation, this idea of right to self-government, had emerged, which was distinct to the revolutionary idea of self-determination.
How is it distinct, the
And
idea between self-government and self-determination?
so self-government was an old idea that comes from British policy in India. It's based on the trusteeship, so this idea that an enlightened nation has the right to govern a people until they are ready to become independent, but the decision as to when they are ready for self-government is determined by the administering or colonial power. Self-determination is a revolutionary concept which emerges out of the Socialist International in the early 20th century, and the debates between Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, and the practice of the Bolsheviks after they came into power, which is more revolutionary, violent idea that we don't need to wait for anyone else's discretion. We have the right to independence immediately, and we can throw off the imperial yoke using armed struggle if necessary. So it's quite a radically different idea.
No,
So
I
that
see.
idea existed in international law, but it was kind of confined to the fringes. It wasn't enshrined in the League of Nations Covenant, which doesn't mention self-determination, in contrast to the United Nations Charter, which does. And one of the reasons why the UN Charter does is because, of course, the Soviets were original members of the United Nations and ensured that there was some reference to it. And of course, you also had a couple more non-European states that were members of the United Nations, unlike well, there were also a few of the League of Nations, but not many. The League of Nations was primarily still a European club.
Yeah. Let me ask you some basic questions about international law. The first is it illegal, according to international law, to invade a sovereign territory? And is it illegal to occupy a territory? And if so, when did it become illegal?
So it's illegal to invade. For one state to invade another state has been contrary to international law. definitely following the adoption of the UN Charter. Some would say even earlier, beginning with the Stimson Doctrine and non-recognition in the 1930s. So the Article 2, Paragraph 4 prohibits use of force to acquire territory. But that's still interstate in character. So things always get complicated with international law when you're dealing with non-disputed territories or territories where sovereignty is unclear. So the ex-colonies. Occupation is slightly different. So occupation is depending on your view, it's either a legal regime or it's a question of fact. In either case, it's seen as a temporary, it's supposed to be a temporary right of administration to control territory after a conflict, after territory has been subdued, and the idea is you preserve the rights of the existing population until the end of the conflict, and ideally until there's a peace treaty, until the conflict is resolved. But the way the Israelis they've prolonged this occupation and distorted it to such an extent that it isn't really an occupation anymore. It's simply another colonizing scheme, as you know, with the settlements. So it's being used. It was used for many years, and in an incorrect fashion, just to more like creeping annexation, I would say. It doesn't really resemble what an occupation is supposed to be, and that is what's being challenged before the International Court of Justice in the advisory opinion proceedings.
And here's another basic question that will help set the stage for our conversation. Is there a statute of limitations when it comes to international law?
What do you mean by statute of limitations?
Okay, so like if you take a look at the Haganah, is there a sort of a number of years after which people are no longer held accountable?
Well, if they're dead. Say about the Haganah, I mean that's like more than 70 years ago.
More than 70 years ago. But in the 60s, for example, they weren't dead.
You mean for war crimes and crimes against humanity? No, so there isn't inferior limitations. The problem there is that you need to find a tribunal that has jurisdiction to try individuals for these crimes when they took place.
Yeah.
And that didn't exist in the 60s. We have one now. I mean, individual states could have, if they had domestic laws providing for prosecuting war criminals, and if they were able to capture these individuals, they could have prosecuted them under their own domestic jurisdiction. Of course, Palestine in the 60s was split between Egypt and administered by Egypt and part of the Union of Jordan. So they wouldn't have been able to. Palestine as such wouldn't have been able to have tried anyone. And in those days, it was a different ideological moment as well. The Palestinians were more revolutionaries, not so interested in
legal documents and briefcases. And what do you think the role of the international law is today, in today's moment, given your study of the last 100+ years?
You mean international in terms of its relationship to the Arab-Israeli conflict?
Yeah. I mean, as I'm not a lawyer, I'm deeply invested in understanding and the conflict and understanding the occupation, and deeply invested in hopefully seeing justice found in Palestine. And every single time I hear ideas of international law, sort of, cited and evoked, let's wait for the international legal community to help sort this out. I can't help but scoff. I can't help but sort of chuckle underneath my breath and die a little inside, because I can't imagine that that's an arena in which any of this will be sorted out. But I'm naive in more ways than one, and so this is probably one of them in which I'm naive. So I'm curious, is there a real role for that arena?
Yeah, I mean, well, up until now, international law has mainly been more of a discourse, right? It's a language that's used to castigate, condemn particular policies and practices. I mean, things are starting to change as a result of developments. One would hope they're starting to change over the last, I'd say, 15 years. Palestine becoming an observer state at the United Nations, accessing International Criminal Tribunal, the International Criminal Court, being able to make use of the international. Well, they had access to the ICJ before, but they have access to it as a state now. Um, these recognitions coming through. I think tomorrow. That's why the date was important, because
Mm.
if you we're supposed to have a number of countries recognizing Palestine tomorrow. Um, I've heard Norway, Spain, and others. So they haven't actually recognized it yet, but we're expecting it tomorrow. I think this does matter to a certain extent, but I know in the sense of how Palestinians are treated. Will they have any change in their lives in the immediate term? Most unlikely. We had the arrest warrants issued yesterday from the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. It is a big moment, but at the same time, it's difficult to see how those individuals who have been indicted will end up in The Hague, unless one of them makes a mistake and travels to a country that has jurisdiction. So at the moment, I would say there's still more heat than light. Um, uh, and the other problem, of course, is the larger geopolitical situation. So international law is still a very I would say still a very rudimentary system.
Uh-huh.
This is still based on primarily on state consent and being a state. So and having access to institutions, having sovereignty, having power, having control over territory. None of these things that
Right.
Palestine has, to the exclusion of any other state, so long as the occupation is maintained and violence is used against them. Um, and of course, the geopolitical situation is not a good one, in the sense that the world now is very much divided. So you have these blocks that are emerging, Russia, China, the so-called Western states, all invoking international law when it suits them, or what they call the global legal order, but having slightly quite different understandings of what that means. So for the Russians and the Chinese, they very much emphasize, and for other countries from the global south, they very much emphasize the international law that emerged during decolonization, um, whereas the West is kind of like trying to bypass that moment,
Yeah.
and thinks of itself as a bit of still as almost as though we're going back to the League of Nations, this idea of an exclusive club of like-minded states, and so this creates all kinds of difficulties for enforcing international law. We still have to go through the UN Security Council. It might be possible. I've argued in my own scholarship that in terms of the enforcement of international law, it may be possible to use some of the old anti-apartheid instruments, treaties, special bodies, and the like, to coordinate. I suppose another subgroup of global South states to take measures to try and induce compliance with international law.
How did that
Um,
actually happen in the case of South Africa? Like, is there, whenever I hear anyone talk about this, I always wonder, is this completely unprecedented? Has this ever been done? Um, if there's essentially like coordination and collusion among the largest economies and military forces in the world and agreement, has there ever been a successful organization of interests, competing interests, to say, actually, quite frankly, we are going to find a way to get a win in this arena? Or is it completely unprecedented?
I mean, South Africa, the strategy there was multi-pronged. There was a legal arena, but also, and the legal arena was at the international level, but also at the domestic level. But there was also liberation movements. There was
Mm-hmm.
armed struggle. There were boycotts, divestment. It wasn't just in South Africa. It was also in Europe, in America. Intersected with a civil rights struggle as well, and the end of the Cold War. So there's some differences, some parallels also to the Palestinian struggle too, but also major differences. I mean, in terms of the institutions, there were certain bodies. I'm not going to pretend that these will make a radical difference, but it's intriguing that South Africa was, the ANC and the other liberation movements were successful in using mechanisms at the United Nations through the General Assembly. So the Security Council was not always, but for the most part, deadlocked. But nonetheless, they were able to galvanize other states from the global south, and especially the socialist bloc, to support the liberation struggle against the Pretoria government. And there were these UN bodies that coordinated, monitored what was going on in South Africa, participated in boycotts, divestments, and sanctions as well, outside of the formal structure in the UN Security Council. So that could be an avenue the Palestinians could try to pursue today if there's an appetite for it. And it seems that there might be, at least over, I mean, given the amount of activity there is, for example, before the International Court of Justice over the genocide, over the claim of genocide, and other developments.
Speaking of case studies, you were talking about mandate A, B, and C. You know, in a reading of history, you can look at the sort of individuals who made some of these decisions, and think of them as being devilish and totally puppet masters of understanding exactly what they're doing and all the ramifications of what they're doing. And then there's different readings of history where you can say, okay, surely they had their own interests that weren't aligned to the interests of the inhabitants, but maybe they're a little less smart than we think. And maybe they were just fumbling and making tons of mistakes, serving their own interests, but they had no idea the extent to which their decisions would have ramifications. I'm curious if you look at the case of Palestine versus other mandates in the Arab world and other examples around the world. I know you were one of the people behind this book about comparing India and Palestine. I'm curious if you think the architects of the mandate in Palestine, whether it's Sykes-Picot or Balfour or any of the other people, would have thought that, oh yes, this worked out perfectly. This is exactly the way we expected things to go. This is what we hoped it would look like 100 years on.
I don't think anyone knew what it would look like. And Balfour, for example, used to often refer to the policy as as his great experiment. So if it's an experiment, you don't know which way it's going to go. And it's also highly arrogant to speak of mixing peoples and juggling territory, other people's territory, as an experiment, kind of. And of course, he had a long, dark, bloody history in what is now the Republic of Ireland. Northern Ireland was one administered as one country at the time. So yeah, you had all these. And it was Balfour, it was David Lloyd George. I've argued in my first book, From Coexistence to Conquest, that the interest amongst those people was primarily related to the Jewish question in Europe and basically encouraging migration out of Europe to Palestine. So they definitely knew what they were doing in that sense, and I don't think they cared. And they were deeply anti-Semitic and racist as well. You can also see this in debates on South Africa, on India. I mean, really, like, I don't have exact quotes, but if you to look and speaking openly, racist comments in Parliament, for example.
Yeah.
Not having an issue with this kind of language. So I think, of course, no one knows what will happen in 100 years' time, but they knew what they were doing at the time. They were skilled diplomats.
Trying to get basically the Jews of Europe out of Europe, whether it's into the Horn of Africa or into the Levant or wherever, just get them somewhere else.
Encourage migration. And this is all going back to the early debates in the early 1900s in the UK. And the first colonization scheme the Brits considered was the Uganda Plan, of course. And there are some really interesting parallels. There's a text of that plan and the text of the plan that became the mandate for Palestine. Can you idea.
Tell me about this Uganda one? I've heard a little bit about it, and maybe I even made a mistake when I said the Horn of Africa. but it would be
Yeah, it's
useful.
East Africa.
East
East
Africa.
Africa.
So
So
help me understand.
the plan was actually drafted by David Lloyd George when he was an MP. So David Lloyd George was a prime minister during the Balfour Declaration, but in 1903, I think it was, he was just a member of parliament and a solicitor. But he actually drafted this scheme, and it was actually called the colonization scheme for East Africa. And basically, they needed East Africa at that time was a British protectorate, and so they were discussing with the Foreign Office to what extent it would be lawful to do this, and there's a whole complication about the land question, who would fund it. The idea is there'd be a Jewish colonial trust, same idea they would later use, um, and who would be responsible for the administration and for the laws and regulations, and the Brits wanted to keep control of those. Um, and so what's interesting to see is to see that idea kind of repurposed for Palestine 20 years, or less than 20, 15 years later. And it's the same people involved. And so I think it was a Zionist organization. So what happened is the technical commission was sent to, well, it's actually, they say Uganda, but actually it was part of what is now Kenya and Uganda. And this commission had one Jewish member, I think two Brits. And the Brits thought it was a great location, fertile lands, but the Jewish member wasn't very enamored with it. He said there's no reason for Jewish people to go to East Africa. There's no historical, cultural link to it. It was then debated, I think, in I can't remember which Zionist Congress, and it was actually, I think, it was rejected by them for the same reason.
I always heard that it was in Ethiopia. Why did?
No. So you get Ethiopia. Well, I think that was part of the Italian sphere. So it couldn't be Ethiopia. It was the Uganda plan, which includes part of what is now Kenya. They were building the railroad from Mombasa to Nairobi, I think, around that same time. Yeah.
So it was like anywhere. Just get.
Yeah, I mean, other plans were considered in, I think, Argentina and Libya and the Sinai. There was a technical commission. Lord Cromer was involved in the Sinai plan. Lack of water is what killed that plan. But Palestine, I guess, was really, because of the holy places, was really the most attractive option. In fact, and Herzl he first went to the Ottomans before he went to the Brits, and the Ottomans turned him down. So he ended up going to other countries, I think Italy, Germany, France, but the Brits. He cleverly linked support for the colonization scheme to resolving what they call Britain's immigration problem. In the early 1900s, there was a lot of people fleeing Eastern Europe, ending up in the east end of London, and so he was very clever when Herzl actually appeared before the Royal Commission of Alien Immigration as a witness, and he actually basically read out his Jewish state, his idea of the Jewish state in his famous book. He actually kind of summarized it to the commission. And on the commission was Lord Rothschild, was one of the members of the commission.
Crazy.
And Lord Rothschild is the addressee of the Balfour Declaration. It begins with "My dear Lord Rothschild."
Yeah, of course. In your studies, when do you feel like that storyline gets lost in the narrative, sort of the public consciousness in Europe? When did it go from, okay, we are solving the quote unquote Jewish immigration problem, to we are supporting Israel no matter what?
Well, I think maybe the Jewish issue, probably after the Holocaust, is probably that it changed into a humanitarian and human rights issue, and I think people forgot about these earlier debates, especially in international law. It all became a moment of one school of thought, at least the mainstream. If you were taught international law 20 years ago, was said, after these horrors, we created this new institution, and then, which by the way isn't completely true, because you had the Rift Valley massacre just after D-Day, after World War II, and you had other kind of, and of course they wanted to recolonize. The European powers wanted to get their colonies back, but the general view one was taught was that you had this United Nations, and you had the emergence of human rights in the 60s and 70s, and international law was this good thing, and we were heading in the trajectory of something positive. And then I think what happens about maybe 10, 15, maybe more than that, 20 years ago, people began to take a more critical approach, especially to the history. They start to look at the continuities, and the unfair structures that were established after the Second World War, especially from Global South scholars. So you have the emergence of critical approaches and third world scholarship, third world approaches to international law, which that emerges initially in the 1990s, but really gathers pace after the Iraq War, and the war, and during the so-called War on Terror moment.
Can you explain this idea of mandate A, B, and C, and the differences, different ways these mandates were treated under the legally, I suppose?
Yeah, so the League of Nations was established, Treaty of Versailles after the end of the First World War. I think it's attached as an annex to all of the peace treaties. It creates a new international organization. The United States under Woodrow Wilson played a big role in drafting this treaty, but ironically never joined it due to opposition in the Senate, in the US Senate. And what the mandate system, it appears in Article 22 of the Covenant. It enshrines this concept of the sacred trust of civilization. So this kind of colonial language that I think it goes back to the Congo internationalization plans in the 1870s. Possibly some people trace it back earlier to India, British India. But what it does is it creates a class. So the mandates were the former colonies of the Axis powers. So Japan, Germany, and the Ottomans mainly. And then so in old days, these territories would be dispersed amongst the victors, and they would become new colonies. But they said colonies are not a good idea, so we'll create mandates instead, and we will distribute them.
Is that just a change in name, Lily?
Change in name, but also a change in the sense that the Article 22, if you read it, doesn't allow them to control these, well, at least in respect of A and B class mandates. They're not supposed to administer them forever. They're not supposed to administer them as though they're part of their own territory. They're supposed to administer them on the benefit of as a sacred trust for the benefit of the indigenous populations. So they're supposed to get the beneficent values of Western culture, be trained to be good citizens and good government, and this kind of stuff until they are considered civilized. So it's a language of civilization to join the family of nations, and never clear when that moment would be met.
Was that language written cynically? I mean, did the people writing those words, did they actually think to themselves, well, this is a sacred trust, and we are in fact doing this in your own interest? I mean, it's an impossible question for you to answer fully, but I'm curious to understand what you would think. I mean,
I think the French and the Italians were very skeptical about the whole notion. The Brits were playing devil's advocate. I think maybe Wilson maybe a bit naive, because I think he was really pushing for this idea, trying to distinguish the new world order from the old one, and he probably was a believer in that notion. But he was also a very racist notion, because he himself was very racist. And maybe he was thinking of Reconstruction in the United States of America. The idea that people have to be uplifted. Maybe it comes from theology, I don't know, as well. Protestantism, possibly.
Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off. I can't, it's hard for me to see, because for me, from where I'm standing, it seems like a change in name only. But it's interesting that they went to such lengths to put lipstick on the pig. I mean, it seems...
Well, it's not a change in name only, because previously, if you annexed the territory, it became part of your sovereign territory. You could apply your laws to that territory and treat it just like any other part of the France or UK or Italy. But if you stipulate that, no, this has a different status to your own territory, it probably does make a difference. In the sense that you have to then pass legislation in the interests, taking into account the interests of the people who live on that territory, that only applies to that territory. So maybe it's a subtle one, I don't know, but there is a difference there. And at the same time, there is this unofficial time limit for when these territories will become independent, with Iraq becoming the first, supposedly the first independent state in 1933. But again, they had all these different informal ways of control, even following independence.
For example,
Appointing advisors, controlling the foreign relations of the territory, extracting concessions, giving foreign oil companies the right to exploit resources, that kind of thing. So although someone might be independent notionally, they're actually also subject to all different types of control and domination.
yeah. Okay. Within the Palestinian complex context, before the Nakba, I wonder, did folks in Europe and folks in Palestine at the time, did they think that a Palestinian state was a foregone conclusion? Was, if you were the betting odds, so to speak, favoring that, yes, there would be a Palestinian state the same way there would be an Iraqi state, there's a Jewish minority. It's just a matter of time, and there's going to be a religious minority that needs to be protected under this whatever legal structure that is created. I mean, was it most likely that there was going to be a Palestinian state, and then somehow the tables turned so dramatically after World War II?
Well, there were differences of view on this issue. This is the whole problem, because the Jewish community wanted to have most of the mainstream Zionists wanted their own state, and made it clear from the start. But it was fudged. The language was fudged. They spoke of a national home, not a state, in Palestine, not instead of Palestine. You had British policy flip-flopping. So at one point they favour a national home, then they say no in the 1939 White Paper, no, it's going to be a Palestinian state, and implying that a Jewish home would be in that state and immigration would be subject to the control of whoever runs that Palestinian state. But then they go back to this idea of partition and two states in 1947, and then 6 months later reverse that, talk about trusteeship, of having the two communities living together. But it's never clear who would be the master of the territory. Even it would have been the UN, supposedly, under the UN trusteeship plan for a 10-year period. But given the conflict between the two communities, you'd have to have had a large armed force, I guess, to maintain the peace. So, yeah, it was known as Palestine, but it depended who you asked. what the territory would how the ultimate identity of the territory would be. And that again explains why the Peel Commission proposed partition and the UN did, to make it clearer that neither side would get all they wanted. That was the mentality of the at the time.
One of your most recent papers explores this idea of genocide as a form of apartheid. Is that a controversial topic is that a controversial opinion in the world of international law? Do people largely agree that apartheid is a form of genocide?
I mean, I don't know. I've not taken a poll to ask people whether it's a controversial view or not. I do know, for example, which was what we argued in the blog post, is that the definition of apartheid, the inhumane acts listed in Article 2 of the 1973 Apartheid Convention, are identical. Some of them, at least one of them, is virtually identical to what appears in the 1948 Genocide Convention. And there was this debate in the 70s, and it's still mentioned in some of the textbooks, not textbooks, but specialist literature, that in certain circumstances apartheid can be a form of genocide. I mean, my argument, I would argue that if it's either one or the other, it can't be both. So if an apartheid situation becomes a situation of genocide, then it's genocide. It can't still be apartheid. But there is this link between systems of racial discrimination and domination and apartheid. We saw it in Nazi Germany, we saw it in Rwanda, we've seen it in other locations. Kind of dehumanizing language and rhetoric policies can, in violent situations, in conflict situations, lead to mass killings of particular groups of people.
In the case of the sort of ICJ, what happens if if South Africa's case against uh, that's making an argument that a genocide is occurring in Palestine and Gaza. What are the consequences of that? What are the possible consequences if it's found to be true in that?
I mean, that court itself is not. It can't try individuals, so it would be primarily declaratory in the sense that it would go to the UN Security Council for enforcement. Nothing will happen, but it's still. But the very finding of genocide could have repercussions in the domestic, in a whole range of areas. It could lead to prosecutions of Israelis in domestic courts. It might influence the ICC, maybe, because the ICC hasn't actually opened a file on, or has not indicted Israeli leaders for genocide. It might have implications for the arms trade. There's the UN Arms Trade Treaty. You're not supposed to send weapons or systems that can be used for the commission of genocide. So it could. But the problem is, though, is that we don't expect a judgment on the merits for many, many years. I mean, this could go on for a decade. If you look at the Yugoslavia cases, for example. So the most obvious place to look at is the ICC, but a trial won't start there unless they have warm bodies in The Hague, and that's, well, I mean, they could always indict lower-ranking leaders, perhaps, and maybe someone makes a mistake or someone travels to the wrong place and is picked up.
What are the quote unquote wrong places or right places?
Wrong places would be states that have obligations
But
under the Rome Statute.
somebody, I was at lunch yesterday when the news of the ICC again, the news against Netanyahu and I forgot if the second person mentioned was. And somebody said, "Oh, okay, but nothing's going to happen to them unless they travel." And then everyone around the table said, "Where are they allowed to travel? Where are they not allowed to travel?" And it occurred to me, I have no idea. So where are they allowed to travel, and where are they not allowed to travel?
So, well, they can travel anywhere if they want to, but they'd be at risk of being arrested if they travel to certain countries, so countries that are signatories to the Rome Statute. So that's a large part of Europe. I think Latin America and Africa, but none of the nasty countries have signed are members of the court, including, for example, the United States of America. So it's not going to have any impact for travel to the US. And it'll be interesting to see how countries with close relations to Israel, but that are parties to the Rome Statute, react.
Like what is what's an example?
I don't know, but for example, you have had cases in the past where, okay, it wasn't Rome Statute, you had attempts to detain Israeli politicians in UK courts, and somehow they managed. The Foreign Office would always issue some kind of immunity certificate, and they would escape. In this case, I'm not sure they can do that because that would be direct conflict with their obligations under the Rome Statute. So I think it's going to just create a lot of... And the UK is pretty angry because they think it's affecting their diplomacy. They probably have to travel to Israel now to have top secret meetings with Israeli leaders. They can't do them in London anymore, so it's probably inconvenient to them. And other countries that are very closely aligned to the current Israeli governments. So yeah, it could be quite. And we have to see how states react. Do they? At the end of the day, the ICC is dependent on funding from its members, and if they start to cut funding in reaction to this, it'd be very sad in a way. But if they were to do that, they're totally undermining the court. But stranger things have happened.
Yeah. Universities all over the U.S. are sort of embroiled in this situation as protest movement have sprung up on college campuses all over. most notably maybe not most notably, but for me, most conspicuously at Columbia. You're a professor at the UK, and you noticed similar things happening on campuses in the UK?
Yeah, I don't know if they're as big as in the US, but we do. I mean, I know what's happening in my university. We have an encampment that's set up in one of the campuses. So they've set up an encampment in the. So I'm at Nottingham University. I'm on University Park campus. There's no encampment here, but there's an encampment in what we call the Jubilee campus, and the reason why there's one there is there's the engineering building, and a lot of in this part of the UK we have one of the biggest employers is the arms industry. So we have BAE Systems, which is the biggest developer of advanced weapons in the UK, fighter jets, drones, nuclear submarines, all kinds of things. And we have Rolls-Royce as well, which makes engines, as you probably know, for planes, and also has a military component. So the encampment is set up there because some of these students who come through the engineering school acts like a feeder for work placements with these companies. And so they're trying to draw attention to the role of these companies in the arms trade and to what's happening, obviously, in Gaza, trying to put the pressure on the university here to basically be forthright and open about their investments and their cooperation with Israeli institutions. And then the argument is to divest from them. So to identify and report, and then divest.
Yeah.
The university tried to evict the students. They went to. So I don't know the latest. So they went to court, and I'm not sure they were successful. I think they didn't succeed, but I'm not fully. I think the encampment is still there at the moment.
Yeah. It's one of these things where in the U.S., I mean, I'm calling it in Beirut right now, so I'm not in the U.S. and haven't been in the U.S. since October. But I'm curious if you feel like there is a sea change in public interest in the UK about the occupation, about what's happening in Palestine, what justice may or may not look like.
It's really hard to say. So I'm skeptical. Maybe because I've been working on this issue for more than 20 years. People say that there's a change, that these big protests. People say, "Oh, this is different than before." But I've heard people say this 20 years ago during the Second Intifada. I remember during the first big conflict in Gaza, Operation Cast Lead. I think Norman Finkelstein wrote a book saying this time they went too far. This is going to lead to change, and it didn't lead to any change. So I've become a bit of a skeptic in this regard. And I'm a bit of a skeptical about. I mean, my own view is that most people, there is a hardcore that supports the Palestinians, and that group's probably got bigger. But most people, I think, are just indifferent. They're indifferent to it. They're either indifferent because they don't know anything about it and they don't care, or they may have an interest in it in terms of watching the news and stuff, but they don't want to say anything. And then there's a class of people who are just terrified of the whole subject. I think that's a lot of people terrified because of fear of being. I mean, before the conflict, we had a big problem with academic freedom and doing events and anti-Semitism and definitions of anti-Semitism. That's still going around. Lobby groups writing threatening letters to VCs and others. The government threatening to cut funding to universities if they don't toe the line. And we have a very hostile government in the UK. The Conservative. I mean, they've been in power for a very, very long time now. I mean, really hostile. So that affects, I think. And the Labour Party, the main opposition party, hasn't been particularly great. Although somebody told me that apparently they have welcomed the ICC arrest warrant. So if that's true, that's interesting. I do know that within the Labour Party, not in the senior leadership level, but on the kind of grassroots level, there's far more support for Palestinian rights. So if there's supposed to be an election, I think in the fall, October, November in this country. So if there was a change of government, you might see a change in policy. We might not. We have to wait to see. And generally, the whole feeling in Europe, the whole is particularly Germany, is pretty bad, pretty dire. There are some unusual countries
Yeah.
like Spain and others who've taken a very pro-Palestinian position, and they're one of the countries that's supposed to come out and recognise Palestine tomorrow or later this month. So, but the UK at the moment, it's not a great place for this kind of to be a Palestinian.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I'd love to ask you for some recommendations that are maybe books or papers or scholars that come to mind that are good places to look for thoughtful history or analysis of the conflict, whether it's from a legal perspective or otherwise.
You mean specifically in the Arab-Israeli conflict, or on international law and imperialism more generally?
Maybe both. Why not?
Okay, probably the leading text on empire and international law is probably Anthony Angie's Imperialism and the Making of International Law. I mean, there's a ton of stuff actually that's come out since then, but that's probably the best text. I'm looking at my bookshelf,
Perfect.
trying to see what I've got up here. On Palestine, on Israel, I mean, Noura Erakat had her book, Justice for Some, that came out. That's another good one. I mean, nothing of right now is jumping up at me. That's because right now all my stuff's on my bookshelves. So I'm doing my next book project on apartheid as a crime against humanity. So
Yeah.
my bookshelf is full of books on apartheid. So I've taken a slightly bit of a sidestep recently. I still write and talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict, but I'm kind of like trying to do something that's directly related, but that isn't directly on it.
Yeah.
Partly because it's rather depressing to be constantly writing about something that just keeps getting worse, never better. And kind of South Africa's, depending on your view, is a kind of like happy story, maybe.
Happier.
Or happier.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I'll ask you. Maybe you can send a list afterwards that I think comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, if you let me know before, I could have given it
Yeah.
more
No,
thought.
that's okay. We'll put this up on the blog. So if you send over anything, I'll afterwards. We'll
Yeah.
put
Well, I
up.
could promote my own book, Making Endless War,
Sure.
the Vietnam and Arab-Israeli conflicts in international law, which is it's a co-edited book with New Zealand, a Kiwi colleague who's based in Australia, and that looks at the kind of language and the discourse on war that comes out of the decolonization movement, the war in Vietnam, and the Arab-Israeli conflicts, and influence especially American and Israeli government lawyering. That's cool. I would say that's a great book.
Yeah.
Um,
Perfect.
yeah.
My last question for you is really tough to answer, but I'm curious. Is justice possible in Palestine?
What do you mean by justice?
I guess, I mean, justice is a legal term, right?
Huh.
Is it a legal term?
I mean justice. Do you mean justice as in a political solution, or do you mean justice as in people who have been subject to crimes getting redress in a criminal court, or
I mean it the way I see it on slogans that I see spray painted across flags at protests, right? You always see this term, justice for Palestine. And whenever I see that, I always think to myself, I think justice is a legal concept. It might be a moral concept as well. It might be maybe even just like a logistical concept. But I think it has to do with the law probably most closely. And I wonder if it's even possible. And so my question to you
this
is
is the problem with
justice
the word.
possible?
I mean, those slogans. You'd have to ask the people who wrote those slogans what they mean. I think it's a word. And justice for who? I mean, for Palestinians, I guess is your question. What would they see as just? And some people would answer that in different ways. They would say a peaceful solution, maybe a one state where everyone's treated equally, maybe two states where two groups of people can govern themselves without interference from the other. Maybe justice would be seeing Netanyahu and Gallant prosecuted at the International Criminal Court. Justice for Hamas, for example. I think they came out with a statement saying it wasn't good enough going just after the top brass. They want to go after all the Israelis that are responsible. So that's everyone from the company level to the top. So justice in that kind of vision is much bigger and broader, and would probably envisage a kind of like Nuremberg style, a victory at some point, and then a victor's justice in the form of some kind of special tribunal that would try all these people. But so again, that's why I think the word justice can be used in can mean many different things. Justice might mean compensation for all the lands and properties stolen. Justice might mean the right of return of all Palestinian refugees. So yeah, it's a word that can be used in all different kinds of ways.
Yeah. Do you feel like when you are at a protest that like the intellectual work that you do that's focused on understanding the legal history and understanding the sort of pathways through the legal system is so disconnected to what people are chanting and protesting and asking for on the streets? Do you feel like they are just completely disconnected?
Yeah, I think I haven't actually been to a protest to my shame. Well, partly because I got a little kid and I don't go to London much. But there is going to be one in Nottingham this Saturday, and I'm planning to go. I mean, I have been to protests on campus, but there's a massive disconnect, and there's always been a disconnect because international law is a law for elites. It's for states. It's for the ruling classes of these states and those who purport to work for them, and so it is far removed from those whom it's supposed to. I don't even think it's supposed to serve them either. But it's intergovernmental. It's between the most powerful, supposedly sovereigns, and their relations and their disputes between them. It doesn't filter down. I mean, the whole argument is human rights law is supposed to be about the individual, protecting the rights of the individual. But as soon as the government gets involved, policy, as soon as it's a question of high policy, you remove it from the people. And so it is. I mean, the way I see international law primarily still, it's elite, it's diplomats, it's the law of diplomacy. That's how it historically evolved. Famous professors who had these chaired. I mean, international law is now much broader. Every university has an international law school, but I'm still old enough to remember when international law wasn't even taught in most schools. It was elite preserve of Oxford and Cambridge and maybe Edinburgh and a few other of the elite schools, and they would be, these lawyers would have very close relations with the governments. So you'd always have, if the British government wanted to have a case with another country, they would probably they'd have their own government lawyers, as civil servants, but they might hire someone on their team from Oxford or Cambridge, and that's been going on for centuries, for instance. And the French have a similar system, the Germans and the Italians. So it is very much an elite. It is an elite process. It's great for news headlines, social media, but it's far removed from the kind of law you'd think of that affects most people in their day-to-day lives in any country, like the kind of the criminal courts or the religious courts perhaps you might have in the Middle East, or civil courts, when you get divorced or buy property or have a land dispute, small claims tribunal, completely divorced. You're a very high level and I would say it's also very abstract in some ways as well, because you're dealing with government policy mainly.
Yeah, man, it's tough. It's really, 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 really tough. I thank you for coming on. I know that it's a tough time to have this conversation, but I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you. Thanks, Mikey. It's been great talking to you.
So people can find you on Twitter or on social media. It's easy to find you. I hope people can pick up the books. And if you're interested in seeing some more of those books, we will put up some of the recommendations up on Daftar, so please check it out. And if you get a chance, check out the other podcasts that we have all over the Afikra Podcast Network. Thanks so much.
Thank you.